Your doctor just told you that your blood work is normal, but here's why that may be the most dangerous thing you'll hear this year. I've been working in longevity medicine for years now.
Dr. Desmond Ebanks is here.
Hey, Dr. Desmond Ebanks. He is the founder of Alternative Healthcare.
And I've analyzed thousands of executive blood panels. What I've discovered is absolutely shocking. The metrics that actually predict whether you'll maintain peak performance into your 70s or burn out by 50 are rarely even measured in your standard annual physical. And here's the thing that really gets me fired up about this. The so-called normal ranges that your doctor is using, they've shifted dramatically over the past 15 years. Not because we've discovered new science, but because the entire population has become metabolically sicker. So when your doctor says your fasting insulin of 18 is normal, what they're really saying is that you're average among a population that's increasingly insulin resistant. Let me start with the most important metric that virtually no executive is tracking properly, and it's probably the single best predictor of your next 20 years of performance. We're talking about fasting insulin. Now, most people think insulin is just about blood sugar, but that's really missing the bigger picture. Insulin is fundamentally your body's fat storage hormone and energy regulation system. Here's how this works at a physiological level. When you consume something and it gets broken down, sugar enters your bloodstream. Your body releases insulin to move that glucose from your blood into a muscle where you can actually burn it for energy. And your body is incredibly adept at wanting to keep your blood sugar in that normal range. But here's where it gets interesting, and this is where most executives are getting into trouble without even knowing it. If you're consuming more sugars than your body can efficiently process, your pancreas has to produce more and more insulin to keep that blood sugar normal. And if this goes on for a long period of time, several things happen that are really problematic. First, you can exceed your body's ability to produce enough insulin to move all that glucose. Second, those insulin receptors, they weren't designed to be continually bombarded with high levels of insulin, so they become less sensitive to insulin's effects. That means you have to produce even more insulin to do the same amount of work. And then the third thing that happens is that your muscle cells essentially get full. There's no place else to put the glucose, even if insulin can activate those receptors. And when you get to the point where you can no longer compensate with more insulin production, that's when you develop type 2 diabetes. Now, when those receptors become less sensitive, that's insulin resistance. Here's what's really fascinating about this from a performance standpoint. Even though insulin is working to manage blood sugar, insulin is really your body's primary fat storage signal. In the presence of high insulin levels, your body gets the message to store fat. So when glucose can't be moved into muscle cells, to be burned for energy, it gets rerouted to the liver, repackaged, and stored as fat. And this is where it directly impacts executive performance. Now, high insulin levels means you're constantly in fat storage mode rather than fat burning mode. This leads to those energy crashes, brain fog, and that feeling of being metabolically sluggish that so many high performers experience. Now, here's a shocking part about the ranges. The optimal range for fasting insulin should really be less than 5, but the current normal range from Quest Labs is now somewhere around 18 to 19. That's a huge increase from what it was just 15 years ago. But think about this logically. After an overnight fast, which is how fasting insulin should be measured, you should have very little insulin in your blood because you haven't consumed anything for 10 to 12 hours. So if your fasting insulin is 15 or 18, your body is working 3 or 4 times harder metabolically than it should be, even when you're not eating. There's also a calculation called HOMO-IR, which measures insulin resistance. When you calculate this, it should be less than 2 for you not to have insulin resistance. But most executives I work with have never even heard of this test, let alone have it calculated. Now let's talk about cardiovascular risk assessment, because this is another area where conventional medicine is really missing the mark for high performers. Typically, what's done in conventional medicine is to look at your total cholesterol, LDL, and HDL, the basic lipid panel. And while this information is still useful to look at, it really doesn't reveal your true cardiovascular risk. The problem is that cardiovascular disease isn't just about having a heart attack someday. For executives, it's about maintaining optimal blood flow to your brain, preserving cognitive function, and ensuring that you have the cardiovascular capacity to perform at the highest level for decades. So let me walk you through the advanced markers that actually matter. Number 1, triglycerides. Triglycerides are much more predictive of your cardiovascular disease risk than your total cholesterol. When triglycerides are elevated, it usually indicates that your body is converting excess carbohydrates into fat, and is often associated with insulin resistance. The second marker is apolipoprotein B, or ApoB. This measures the actual number of atherogenic particles, the particles that can actually cause plaque buildup in your arteries. ApoB is responsible for transporting atherogenic lipid particles throughout the body, including including the smaller dense LDL and VLDL particles. You can have normal LDL cholesterol, but high ApoB, which means you have a lot of small dense LDL particles that are significantly more dangerous than those large fluffy ones. It gives you a much more detailed assessment of your cardiovascular risk.
And the third marker that everyone should get measured is lipoprotein A.
This is a genetic risk factor for cardiovascular disease. It's an independent risk factor, meaning even if everything else looks perfect, elevated lipoprotein A significantly increases your risk. And here's the thing, it's genetic, so it doesn't change as much with diet or lifestyle, but knowing your level allows you to be much more aggressive with other risk factors if needed. Now, if you're an executive who wants to maintain peak cognitive performance, you need to understand that your brain is incredibly vascular. Anything that affects your cardiovascular system and your brain function. Poor cardiovascular health doesn't just increase heart attack risk, it reduces blood flow to your brain, leading to decreased cognitive performance, brain fog, and accelerated cognitive aging. The next category we need to discuss is inflammation, and this is probably one of the most underappreciated factors in executive performance decline. There are numerous inflammatory markers you can measure, but probably the most significant one is high-sensitivity C-reactive protein, or hs-CRP. This is a measure of systemic inflammation, the kind of silent chronic inflammation that's happening throughout your body. When you have chronically elevated inflammation, we know that this is really at the root of so many conditions that destroy executive performance. We're talking about heart disease, brain fog, autoimmune conditions, cancer, and accelerated aging. Chronic inflammation is like having a low-grade fire burning throughout your body, constantly draining your energy and cognitive resources. You really want your high-sensitivity C-reactive protein to be less than 1, not just within normal range, but actually less than 1. Many executives I work with come to me with hs-C-reactive protein levels of 3, 4, even higher, and they wonder why they feel like they're aging faster than they should. Another inflammatory marker that's really important is homocysteine. I didn't mention this when I was talking about the other markers earlier, but homocysteine is a measure of methylation adequacy in your body, and it tells you a lot about vascular health. Methylation is a fundamental biochemical process that affects everything from DNA repair to neurotransmitter production. When homocysteine is elevated, you have a higher risk for cardiovascular issues, stroke, and cognitive decline. You want this to be less than 9. But the connection between inflammation and executive performance is direct and measurable. Chronic inflammation affects your brain's ability to produce energy efficiently. It impairs neurotransmitter function, and it accelerates the aging of your cardiovascular system. This translates directly into reduced mental clarity, decreased energy, and impaired decision-making capacity. Now let's talk about kidney function, because this is another area where standard testing often misses critical information for high performance. Kidney function is typically measured by looking at BUN and creatinine levels, but there's another measure that really should be looked at, but it's your glomerular filtration rate, or GFR. This measures the rate at which your kidneys are actually filtering your blood. You want your GFR to be over 60. When it drops below 60, you have some form of chronic kidney disease. Here's the problem. Most executives never get this measured until there's already significant kidney damage. There's a particular issue with creatinine testing that affects a lot of high-performing executives. If you're working out intensely or taking creatine supplements, which is popular now for both physical and cognitive performance, creatine will falsely elevate your creatinine level. So for someone who's taking creatine, there's a different test called cystatin C. This is actually a more accurate measure of kidney function that's not influenced by creatine supplementation or by muscle mass. It's not a perfect biomarker because it can be affected by high levels of inflammation. Why does this matter for executive performance? Well, your kidneys are responsible for filtering toxins from your blood, regulating your blood pressure, maintaining proper electrolyte balance. Poor kidney function affects everything from your energy levels to your cognitive clarity. It's another one of those foundational systems that, when not functioning optimally, creates a drag on your entire performance. If you're realizing that your current health monitoring approach is like trying to run a Fortune 500 company while only looking at last quarter's revenue, you're not alone. This is exactly why I work with executives who want to optimize their biology for peak performance and longevity. Because the standard medical approach wasn't designed for high performers who plan to stay sharp and energetic for decades. The metrics we're discussing today are the foundation of what I call precision longevity medicine, and they're rarely monitored in conventional healthcare. Let's move on to thyroid, because this is absolutely critical for executive performance. And the standard approach to thyroid testing is really insufficient. Most doctors will just check TSH, it's thyroid stimulating hormone. But looking at TSH alone is like judging a company's performance by only looking at management meetings, not actual productivity. You really need to look at free T3 and free T4 to get a complete picture. T4 is the storage form of thyroid hormone, and T3 is the active hormone that actually drives your metabolism and your energy production, as well as cognitive function. Here's what's what's really important to understand. You can have a completely normal TSH, but have insufficient amounts of free T3. And some of this is a problem in the conversion from T4 to T3. This conversion requires adequate levels of iodine and selenium and other minerals. If you're deficient in those nutrients, you'll have difficulty making that conversion from the storage form to the active form. This is particularly relevant for executives because T3 directly affects your brain function, it affects your energy level, and your ability to maintain focus throughout long, demanding days. If your T3 is suboptimal, you're essentially running your metabolic engine at half capacity. Finally, let's talk about body composition, because this is an area where most executives are using completely outdated and irrelevant metrics. Rather than focusing on body weight or BMI, which is honestly a horrible measure for individuals, you need to understand your actual body composition. BMI wasn't even really intended as an individual measure. It's a population measure that doesn't account for muscle mass, really, at all. Everybody in the NFL is technically obese by BMI standards because it doesn't account for muscle mass. If you have someone who's very muscular, their BMI will be high, but they're not necessarily at any health risk. At the other end of the spectrum are those considered, quote, skinny fat. They have a normal BMI and weight, but lack sufficient muscle mass with a very high proportion of body fat. Their health risks are the same as those that are obese. Now, much more important is to get an accurate measure of your body fat percentage and distribution. The gold standard for this in research is a DEXA body composition scan. These aren't that expensive, and you should certainly seek one out in your area. But here's what's really critical. Within the DEXA scan software, you get a measure of your visceral fat. That's visceral adipose tissue. This is the fat inside your abdominal cavity that surrounds your internal organs. High visceral fat, even if you don't have high total body fat, is associated with increased risk for cardiovascular disease, dementia, type 2 diabetes, and a variety of cancers. That is metabolically active and produces inflammatory compounds. For executives, visceral fat is particularly problematic because it directly affects cognitive function and energy levels. It's like having an inflammatory factory inside your abdomen, constantly producing compounds that impair your performance. The health metrics that actually predict your next 20 years of performance, fasting insulin, advanced lipid markers, inflammation levels, comprehensive thyroid assessment, and body composition analysis, rarely monitored in standard medical care. The normal ranges your doctor uses are based on an increasingly unhealthy population, not on what's optimal for peak performance. When you're operating with suboptimal insulin sensitivity, chronic inflammation, or inadequate thyroid function, you're not just risking future disease, you're compromising your current cognitive capacity and energy levels. This isn't just about avoiding illness someday. It's about maintaining the mental sharpness, physical energy, and metabolic flexibility that allows you to perform at the highest levels well into your 70s and beyond. If you value longevity and peak performance as highly as your business success, be sure to subscribe.